Race is ultimately a social construct, and like most social constructs, it is dependent upon members of society in order to exist. Members of society fuel the existence of race via either identification or classification, purporting themselves and others to be denizens of one racial category. These members of society also have the ability to change their identifications and classifications over time, and by doing so, inadvertently make race more fluid as a construct. The fluidity of race not only allows for individuals to flow from one racial group to another, it also allows for these individuals to achieve self-realization via the manipulation of their individual self or external I. Truthfully, there is a great deal of skepticism about whether racial fluidity exists or not. Some sources claim that it only exists in situations where the mixing of different racial groups is already prominent, in places like Brazil or New York City, while others claim it only occurs on a macro level, like in the case of Southern Europeans gradually becoming white during the early 20th century. However, such perspectives fail to take into account the factors of identification and classification that I mentioned earlier. According to Saperstein and Penner, racial identification is a personal statement of community membership selected for either political/economic gain or a sense of belonging. Normally, this statement is backed by physical data, such as a census, survey, or even questions on scantrons asking the race with which you identify. But the statement is still fueled by personal opinion. In this factor, one determines their own race via autonomous decision. Contrastingly, racial classification is a categorical label ascribed on the basis of physical characteristics and linked to stereotypical beliefs about behavior, where outside forces play the role in deciding the racial group to which an individual belongs. Such decisions often rely on stereotypical archetypes rather than physical data, and can even take the form of prejudice, where a person is judged to act in a certain manner because they appear to belong to a certain racial group. In this factor, an individual's race is decided for them. Both racial identification and racial classification rely on people's opinions in order to determine race, and because people's opinions can change over time, so too can their racial identifications or classifications. For example, if we look at the situation of Southern Europeans gradually becoming white during the early 20th century, we see Americans initially classify those from Southern Europe in distinct, non-white racial groups, and those from Southern Europe identify themselves as belonging to such distinct groups, like Italian, Hungarian, or Greek. However, especially as these distinct racial groups assimilated into the local culture, Americans began classifying Southern Europeans as belonging to the white racial category. So much so that in the modern day, many who have Italian, Hungarian, or Greek ancestors identify themselves as white. Thus, we see racial fluidity in action. Those belonging to the once distinct groups of Italian, Hungarian, or Greek flowed into the group of white thanks to changing opinions regarding race. While gathering data on racial fluidity, I discovered articles that spoke about a survey conducted in 1979 called the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, or NLSY. In essence, it was when the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics conducted a 19-year-long survey of approximately 12,690 people, aged from 14 to 22 years old, regarding the transition of school to work, then work to adulthood. Through gathering information about these transitional periods, interviewers also learned about their interviewees' perspectives on certain racial groups. For example, many interviewees ascribed certain socioeconomic statuses to particular racial groups. In particular, those who were married were typically classified and identified as white, whereas those who lost their jobs were typically classified and identified as black. This caused Saperstein and Penner to assess that with certain socioeconomic events came the whitening or darkening of specific people. More specifically, that positive evolutions which result in an upward movement in social class correlate with whitening, while negative devolutions that result in downward movement in social class correlate with darkening. But the interviewees were not alone in their racial biases. According to Alba and his team's research, interviewers also differed in the classifications of their interviewees, with many interviewers who identified as black or Hispanic having a greater awareness of differences among racial groups. One unfortunate aspect of race fluidity, as well as most analyses of race dynamics in America, is that the only two races truly focused on are white and black. In fact, during the NLSY, the interviewers were specifically asked to classify interviewees according to only one of three racial groups: black, white, and other. Such an overlooked detail helps to signify that yes, race is a socially constructed, malleable entity that members of society can alter and flow into at will, but it is also an entity shaped by existing structures like policies, censuses, and governments. These structures are adept at excluding and discriminating against certain groups of people, and even influencing their efforts at performing well in society. Take the case of Anatole Broyard as an example. He was born to African American parents in 1920, but because he appeared white to outside classifiers, he decided to identify as a white man in order to better his chances at social mobility. What Broyard did is a prime example of utilizing racial fluidity to get closer to what psychologist Abraham Maslow referred to as self-realization, where an individual finally realizes what they consider to be their full potential. Broyard saw himself as having the potential to become a great critic and writer, but felt his self-identification as black would hinder his chances at realizing this potential. As a result, he flowed into the racial group known as white for the rest of his life. What Broyard did is commonly known as passing, and it was often used by African Americans as well as other oppressed minorities in order to avoid persecution, allow for greater social mobility, and attain self-realization. Passing is even recorded in fiction, thanks to the novel The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man by James Weldon Johnson. The main character in The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man struggles with more than just determining his race. Instead, he struggles with dealing with Lacan's mirror stage and achieving Maslow's definition of self-realization, all while attempting to conform to a society dominated by racial perceptions. This is most evident in the first chapter of Johnson's novel, when the main character looks at himself in the mirror and finds the liquid darkness of his eyes juxtaposed with his white forehead. According to Sheehy, this is the moment when the ex-colored man underwent what psychologist Jacques Lacan called the mirror stage. Put simply, this is any time in a child's early development stage where they first see their reflection in a mirror, and as a result, subconsciously divide themselves into two subconscious entities, their true self and their I. The true self and the I run parallel to Freud's ego and id, respectively. In both cases, one exists as the incarnation of all our base desires, moral corruptions, and motivations, i.e. the I or the id, while the other exists as the superficial character we present to others in order to satisfy those base desires, i.e. the true self or the ego. Applied to race relations, Lacan's theory fits surprisingly well into the idea of race fluidity, particularly that when a person identifies themselves as belonging to a racial group, they are actually adding a further detail to their internal sense of self, and that when they are classified by others as belonging to a racial group, those outsiders are providing a detail to their external sense of I. And due to the fluidity of race, a person's personal identification is subject to flux, so an individual can alter their internal self or have the external I altered by others in order to achieve what Maslow referred to as self-realization. We see evidence of all these ideologies coinciding in The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, where the main character decides to neither pass as white nor claim blackness outright. In making the decision to identify his self as being racially ambiguous, he allows the rest of the world to decide his race for him, and thereby not be perceived as inferior if his external I is classified as white, or as selling out his own race if his external I is classified as black. Through using racial fluidity to become racially ambiguous, the main character of The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man achieves self-realization and finally differentiates between his self and his I. The psychological concepts of the mirror stage and self-realization strongly coincide with the concept of race being a fluid construct. Socioeconomic hierarchies have created stereotypes and expectations which make some races more desirable than others. And because of this, we often witness race fluidity existing as a tool individuals can use to achieve self-realization. As members of society, we not only have an obligation to continue stretching formerly oppressive constructs such that they can become uplifting in the present day, but also to ensure that oppressive constructs are not willfully created in the future.